This is the Almost Daily Zencast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started. Greetings, friends and internet fam. It is I, your favorite imaginary radio DJ personality opinion talk show host. I say imaginary because I'm just doing this from home on the interwebs. I am not on a radio station, but that's how I envision it in my mind. I wish I was on a radio station because then I could play like music and drop some like fat songs on you while we talk, that are not just weird loopy things that I make on my iPad. For example, for today's episode, I wish I could play some righteous protest songs for you from the 70s, but as I'm feeling lazy, and I only just sort of thought of that in the moment, and I haven't dug up righteous protest songs for you, I'm not gonna. And even if I had them queued up, I'd feel a little weird about it because, it's technically against the EULA of the platform that I'm using. And I am not, for the record, in case anyone might misinterpret anything I say and then leading them to this conclusion, I am not a status bootlicker that blindly follows whatever rules I'm told to follow. But I am an out-of-work theater professional trying to make something happen with this podcast jam so that maybe, just maybe, I can do this for a living instead of worrying about getting a job at Home Depot. Oops, strike them. Can't work for them because they donate to Trump. And in protest, I will refuse to work for them. But you get the picture. I digress. It is weird to be back, folks. It was weird to be off the air. I have often, in the on and off 3-year history of this podcast, taken weird random breaks, which you may or may not notice as you jump around and listen to the episodes in whatever order you damn well feel like listening to. But this one was sort of on purpose, as opposed to most long duration breaks I've taken in the past have mostly been circumstantial. Like, I was too busy to do it because, I was still working in the professional world of live theater on stage. And I, couldn't quite break the time off to sit down and do a podcast. But in this current circumstance of lockdown madness and endless protest, I have been off the air in part out of respect for the chorus of voices that deserve your attention much more than mine, in relationship to the momentum of this protest movement. I don't know an exact number of days that I've been off, but I've only recorded, I think, a total of 3 episodes in the 40 days since George Floyd's death. It feels like that was years ago, doesn't it? Like we've lived a lifetime. Or maybe I've just have spent way too many hours on Facebook sparring with those who cannot wrap their brains around supporting these protests for reform and change when it comes to police violence. I don't like the term police brutality. I want to use the term police violence because, friends, that's what it is. Now, before we go opening cans of worms, I want to take a moment and honor the lives lost. I I've done this as often as, I think is reasonable and necessary. And I don't think it is unreasonable nor unnecessary to do it again. So please join me, if you would, in just a brief moment of silence to seriously remember the lives lost to police violence. And the list is longer than we even realize, because police kill even more people per year than the statistics would reveal to us, because, quite frankly, let us not lose sight of this in this moment of time. We have never had a mission-driven, dedicated system or organization tracking police violence. So to all the known and unknown victims who have died at the hands of those who are sworn to protect and serve, for whatever reason, let us take a moment. 40 days of protest have occurred almost uninterruptedly. I believe it has been uninterrupted. I could be wrong, and if there have been a day or two where there were no official protests happening, then I apologize for the oversight. But to the best of my understanding, for 40 days and 40 nights, America has marched in the streets and rioted at times, getting contentious and violent and even, destructive. And throughout those 40 days and 40 nights of protest, there has been an ongoing discussion, debate, argument, fight in favor of and in opposition to those protests. And I think that's what's made these 40 days feel so much more like a longer period of time than your average 40-day cycle. That for the last 40 days, every day, there has been this ongoing public discourse in which too many people have spewed all kinds of logic and fallacy in opposition to the protests going on. And I find that mind-boggling. I find it mind-boggling because this is a nation that prides itself in its God-given and constitutionally preserved, for lack of a better term, right to peaceably and violently assemble in protest against tyranny. And God bless it if police violence is not officially and informally a form of tyranny against the people. I don't know what the fuck is. And police violence has been a through line that transcends all political ideological trends and parties in power, and has raged almost unbroken since the inception of slave hunters and the formation of these profiteering 13 colonies of slave labor. This argument is exhausting because it seems there are an endless array of people willing to pretend that somehow or another these protests are unfair, illegitimate, unjust. I've seen people say that these protests are unconstitutional. Now, reasonable people can have a reasonable discussion and reasonably disagree about the value of rioting, quote unquote, which is, aggressive, destructive, violent protest, in isolation, in theory, in detached from the current moment, absolutely. But as many people have pointed out, to fixate on one form of violence while neglecting another is absurd, bordering on insane. And of course, the hypocrisy of judging and condemning one group of people for getting so upset that they, to a fringe degree, mind you, to a minimal percentage, choose violent actions while otherwise trying to maintain peaceful protests is, the hubris involved, right? It's to hypocritically say, well, you all can't protest in a violent form, while also simultaneously taking pride in one's own freedom to protest violently. This country loves to romanticize the violence which was required in its own revolutionary establishment as an independent nation state, right? But let's digress. The grievances are real. There have been, in its most minimized form, 200 some odd years of systemic police violence, racist or otherwise. And this is the part that really boggles my mind. When white folk, seemingly well-intentioned white people, and for the record, I do not self-identify as traditional American white. To look me over in a lineup, I don't look as if I shouldn't self-identify as American Caucasian, because I guess you can call me passing. But I was certainly not born here, and I was certainly not raised by people born here. So my whole perspective and mental attitude is not anchored in I come with my own baggage, in other words, right? I come from another place, so, but I've lived here long enough to feel well integrated, and to have directly observed the unfolding of living history, and enough to, and I feel a sense of belonging enough to want to take pride in this nation's aspirational identity and simultaneously exercise my free right to speak openly against it and criticize it as a nation state, as an institution of governance, for all its flaws and failures. Is that not one of the most profound things that is indeed enshrined in the Constitution that that we're all supposed to have access to when we live here? I believe so. Having said that, let's be really clear. There's a lot of things wrong with this country. There's a lot of graphic violence in its history that gets whitewashed, minimized, romanticized, or outright ignored. And while it's easy for people in positions of either privilege or of the mentality of victimhood to say that they should not be held responsible, that this current generation of patriots should not be responsible for the sins of their fathers, that's an absurd way of looking at living culture, in my opinion. And it's not one that's very conducive to the healing of anyone on any side of these complex issues. And that, my friends, is what I am personally all about. At the center of my criticism of this nation, which I simultaneously love, because you can do both things. It strikes me as an absurd lack of rational thinking and a complete lack of understanding of the reality of this nation, how it was formed, and how it has improved, when people demand that you either love this country or get the fuck out for critiquing it, right? Like, that makes no sense, friends. For it is everyone's privilege and right enshrined in the Constitution to vocally speak truth to power. Now, one of the complex issues going on is that many different peoples of different backgrounds live in this country together and have different grievances to grieve, different truths to speak to that power, and different ways of interpreting and viewing that power. Put a big fat red pin on the imaginary corkboard of things we got to come back to about that. Because for those of you who've been listening a long time, you might know, in my humble opinion, the root of the problems that we face, they all reach deeper than even the most avid of conspiracy theorists generally point to. And that is a whole other episode. I've talked about it before, but let's, as my brain tends to spiral out of control, let's refocus here. 40 days of protest, 40 days of civic unrest, 40 days of arguing over Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, right? 40 days of arguing over the reality of systemic racism in the power structures and infrastructure of this country. And it does not seem, the momentum keeps building. I see no end in sight. And for clarity and for the record, today, on Sunday, July 5th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I once again declare that I stand with my brothers and sisters of Afro descent that have a serious and legitimate grievance against the ongoing, perpetual problems inherent in the government of this country. And I stand against all those that either overtly or quietly and privately prefer to support white supremacy, prefer to excuse racism, prefer to turn a blind eye to that kind of hate mongering. There are so many things we could drill down into, but I really wanted to just take a moment as I kind of get back into the swing of things, get back into the habit of trying to do this on the daily. I want to take a moment to just salute the fact that a rainbow coalition of all kinds of human beings have that this powerful, beautiful collection of diversity of Americans and people around the world, because let us not ignore or forget. Let us welcome in the fact that that these protests have reached a global scale. And for 40 days, human beings of every kind of ethnicity, race, creed, color have banded together in unity to speak out against the subtle, often seductive greed and corruption that perpetuates and allows race-based violence in our systems of policing and in our political ideology. We have truly reached biblical proportions, which is a funny thing for me to say, right? Because I'm constantly warning against biblical craziness in our world, but that's a whole nother episode. How many more days will this continue? How much longer will it take for those who sit just on the other side of this unity against a corrupt system of power? Because there are people out there who are threatened, right? And that's why they argue. That's why they interject their arguments. That's why people applaud the president when he says the Black Lives Matter movement is a symbol of hate. And let us take a moment and realize that throughout these 40 days, there has been a concerted, sophisticated, nuanced, subtle, slick, seductive campaign of psychological manipulation that targets otherwise well-intentioned people who do not believe themselves to be racist, and is engineered to encourage them to fear racist fear, race-based fear, let's call it that. And this is on both sides of the issue, right? Now, it's obvious that people of color have literally been terrorized by the police, and that people of color have been targeted by civilians with hate speech and physical violence throughout the history of this country. And while there has been much progress, and the first black president, etc., 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 and I do not mean to minimize that journey of progress, I only mean to say and point out for all those who take it for granted that racism had been over until it suddenly came back, it never went away, folks. Many of us have lived in the bubble of privilege to not experience or directly witness this systemic violence. And violence is more than just people getting shot on the street. Right? Like, hunger is a form of violence because there is absolutely no reason why any American should go hungry. Period. Full stop. Poverty is an engineered assault by those in power against those who have next to nothing to start with. That is a form of violence. The rules and laws and regulations that keep people in poverty are a form of violence. And believe it or not, folks, the system oppresses everyone. I think I already quoted this recently, and my screen has gone dark, so now I gotta do the thing where I retype the thing and dang. Sorry, I'll edit that out in post. I think I recently read this quote, but given where I've been rambling and how I've ended up where I'm at, do I have it? No. Oh, come on. Did I or did I not have this captured here? Oh, God. Now it's going to take me forever to try and find it. The Lyndon B. Johnson quote, which I really shoulda, coulda, woulda. I'm either going to find it in the next 10 seconds or I'm going to just butcher it in trying to... not seeing it. Oh, here it is. Boom. Lyndon B. Johnson is quoted as saying, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." The one thing that everyone out there, that every white person out there reacting negatively and arguing against these protests is seemingly unaware of is that this is part of the agenda and that they have been targeted by content engineered and designed to achieve the goal described in that quote for generations. For Lyndon B. Johnson did not invent that. He merely put it into words so that it was perfectly clear. The system of oppression is nothing new, and we can do a whole episode about my opinions on that and how far back it goes. I may or may not have already discussed it in some previous episode. But the system of oppression is not new, and it is not limited to the American experiment and it is not limited to any of the current trending problems that we attribute to the system of oppression. It is not limited to the currently popular groups commonly blamed or held, to be accountable or behind or in the center of the system of oppression. And the system of oppression has always, in my humble opinion, utilized this kind of psychological manipulation. Give you someone to look down on, and you will not notice what they are doing to you. Trust me, friends, we all grew up bombarded by that kind of psychological manipulation. White, black, doesn't matter. Here in America, in other countries, doesn't matter. The system of oppression has always, since its inception, since its successful hijacking of the human species, it has used that methodology of targeting you and conditioning you to choose to look down on others, which, whether you agree with this statement or not, I humbly suggest to you it truly is doing that. Choosing to look down on others is a form of spiritual violence. The system of oppression is so nuanced that it does this to people of the same ethnic background within one country. You will see a hierarchy, a pecking order, a cascading, tiered system of looking down on your fellow human being. You don't believe that's true? It's captured in our own entertainment media. Here's an example, which will sound really wonky at first, but go watch My Fair Lady. Well, that's classism. Well, what the fuck is classism besides a form of choosing to, for no reason other than these imaginary concepts, look down on others? All isms of that nature, all biases against others, all things that could be summed up as us versus them indoctrination, are dependent on, are created around this manipulation of getting you to judge someone else as unworthy. Doesn't matter who you are, you have been targeted by content your whole life designed to seduce you into doing that. So let us all take a moment and step back and truly realize that while George Floyd's death prompted a very specific group of us to speak out their very specific set of grievances, that they are doing so in solidarity with all of us. The stupidest thing I've seen on the internet is this argument that the Black Lives Matter movement is somehow exclusive of all other lives. That only Black Lives Matter? No. No one said that. To the best of my ability to discern, no one in the movement truly thinks that way. Now, are there extremists in every camp? Create a group identity, and will there be extremists within that grouping? Probably. But that's because of this universal mental conditioning that has been shoved down all of our throats by the system of oppression. Instead of arguing with each other about the most effective way to protest, let us just all unify together in protest And I assure you, the protest will evolve. To come full circle, one of the most reassuring things, to not leave this show on a seeming like I'm all, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Doom and gloom. I'm not all doom and gloom. The most beautiful thing about this 40 days of protests is that, as many people have pointed out, in the community and in the movement, this has been the most diversified that protests demanding reform specifically regarding police violence against people of color. It's the most diverse that they seem to have ever been, which is a wonderful thing. Let us applaud that. And let us stop bickering. My message to everybody else, right? Like, I realize that my potential audience is, I hope, wildly diverse. So it's not like I give I'm not into monolithic messaging or monolithic thinking. Nothing in nature is monolithic. Not when you really get into the nitty-gritty details. And so I don't want anyone to think that I believe that all cops are 100% evil. Of course I don't. Just as I will never abide by the statement, any sort of absolutist statement about people of color, of any color, right? Nor do I tolerate absolutist statements about the human species. It is my humble opinion that the beauty and the sort of catch-22 curse of reality is that, setting aside all concepts of governance, the universe itself provides free will, which means that any given individual has the cosmic freedom to do anything they choose to do, good or bad, right? And that's a whole nother issue for a whole nother episode. At any rate, it has been quite an intense weekend, and I'll be back in after a few minutes break, because I've been rambling long enough for now, to talk about all the different hallmarks we just hit. But I wanted to begin my kick off my return with this and just honor the fact, acknowledge and honor the fact that there have been 40 days, 40 nights of protests, and that history will look back on this, and there will be a right side and an incorrect side, a correct side and incorrect side to be on historically. Once all of this has worked itself out, and that lots of people have clashing opinions of where that boundary actually is. Something we will dig into in some upcoming segments. For now, I want to thank you, dear listeners. I've been actually pleasantly surprised that having recently checked my analytics, that my numbers didn't just fall off a cliff when I stopped going on the air as often as I was doing earlier in the year. So welcome to all the new listeners. I humbly thank you. I send to you a heartfelt namaste. No matter who you are, no matter what political ideology, no matter how much we may agree or disagree, I respect and love you as a human being, and will challenge you on whatever crazy ideas you have about the world, just as I'm sure most people will challenge me on the ideas of mine that sound a little crazy to them, but that ultimately I hope we can agree on the very simple fundamental truth that what the human species needs now is a recognition and a reckoning of this massive spiritual trauma that causes and perpetuates the problem of violence, of human on human violence. That is not to negate, right? I'm not trying to all lives matter because, quite frankly, I understand and agree with all the rebuttals to the all lives matter as an interjection in, but we get into a rabbit hole of debate. We must focus on the issues as they unfold. Yes? And right now, in the heat of this moment, we must honor and acknowledge and contend with, have a reckoning with, find a solution to the simple fact that racism in America never went away, is a very real thing, and is not limited to America. And that as a family of diverse variety on the human theme, we can unite in celebrating our diversity and acknowledging our commonalities. We can transcend the arguments and just heal. And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily Zencast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.